I run PepsiCo. I'm the chairman and CEO of PepsiCo, and PepsiCo is just a phenomenal company, $60 billion, the second largest food and beverage company in the world. I think the greatest thing about our company is that it has an amazing group of people who have what I call a can-do spirit and operate with a must-do sense of responsibility. My grandparents were relentless. Just said, if you promise to do something, do it perfectly or don't do it at all. And my grandfather would always say, Satan has work for idle hands. So he never let me sit idle for even 1 second. So, I just work. I love working.
The sun came up with no conclusions, flowers.
I tell you, when you grow up in a country like India, especially the time that I grew up in the 50s and the 60s, there wasn't much to do there. There was no television, there was no internet, there was nothing. And so we spent our time reading about the world outside. We spent our time understanding other countries, spent our time understanding the politics of the world, the politics of every nation, because there wasn't much going on in India. It was boring. And therefore what happens is you develop a sense of the world. Because India was then an emerging market and still is, you know the problems of emerging markets. And you know how developed markets and multinationals can be a force for good and a force for not so good. So you actually develop a very holistic perspective on business, on governments in general, the role of multilateral organizations like the World Bank and the United Nations. So you really leave India with a very holistic perspective of the world.
Their beds, the city cemeteries humming. I'm wide awake, it's morning.
Why is this the right path for Pepsi? You already have a great soda business and snack food business. Why is this good for you? I mean, look, inherently we know that it sounds good, but why is it good for the business?
So let me start with our portfolio, what we have in the company. We have a range of products which are fun products, Pepsi, Diet Pepsi, Lay's, Doritos, Fritos, all of this existed in our portfolio. And that's been with the portfolio forever. Going back to about 1997, when we first bought Tropicana, and then in 2001 when we bought Quaker and Gatorade, we actually expanded the portfolio to include good-for-you products. Quaker and Tropicana being positive nutrition, and Gatorade being functional nutrition for athletes. That's what we bought ourselves going back 10 years. That was a good $10 billion chunk in the company already. Now fast forward. As you look at the aging of the population, as you look at the focus on health and wellness, this part of the portfolio represents a gigantic growth opportunity. So the first reason why focusing on good for you was important is because we wanted to capture that opportunity. Not at the expense of the fun for you products, is growing both parts of the portfolio. That's why we talk about a balanced portfolio between treats and healthy eats. As a company, we're a growth company. We want to keep growing. But how about growing both parts of the portfolio? Because the growth of good for you is about 3 times the growth of the fun for you.
So the message.
Drugs, I have my woman, they keep away my loneliness. My parents, they have their religion, but sleep in separate houses. I read the body count out of the paper, and now it's written all over my face. No one ever plans to sleep out in the gutter. Sometimes that's just the most comfortable place. So I'm drinking, breathing, writing, singing.
So we had lunch with about 10 bloggers. Amazing women, all of them. And I must tell you, I took away from that conversation more than I contributed. I was in awe listening to them because, just as I talked to you earlier about the fact that women are very powerful and blogging and tweet has given them a lot more power, I had the privilege of talking to these 8 or 10 women who are using this power to putting the power to positive use. They have an incredible sense of wanting to change the world, a can-do sense, but they've married that with sort of a must-do responsibility. So they're taking the power of the blog and saying, how can I change the world? How can I create networks of women? How can I be a support system? How can I be a force for positive change in the world? And what struck me, each one had a story, an interesting story, a difficult story, a tragic story too in some cases. But in spite of that, they overcame all that and they said, look, that's reality. How can I get beyond that to make a positive change to society? I sat there stunned silent saying, people like me ought to look at these women and put them on a pedestal and say, how can I learn from them? How can I learn from them how to use the power of my office to make an even bigger change to society than I am?
Every day I'm on the clock, my mind races with all my longings, but can't keep up with what I got. So I hope I don't sound too ungrateful. What history gave modern men a telephone to talk to strangers, machine guns and a camera lens.
I've always talked about my 5 C's model, and let me talk about them again. The first is competency. I think anybody who wants to be a future leader should have a hip pocket skill that everybody looks at and says, XYZ is the go-to person for that skill. Because unless you're really known for something, and not just as a generalist, you don't stand out from the pack. But in order to be competent at something, you've got to be a lifelong student, because you've got to constantly refine your knowledge of that subject so that you remain ahead and abreast of everything that goes on in that field first.